We're looking at Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6 today. So I'm just going to read them out and you can follow on the screen. So, another time, Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And we thank God for his word. So, back in February, we looked at the immediately preceding passage, and I had not planned this and had the foresight, so I said almost every single thing I'd ever thought of about the Sabbath in that sermon. Like I just tried to put it all in, and then I realized that the next time we were doing Mark, I'd have to talk about the Sabbath again. So I'm just saying that up front, please bear with me today. But this is the next passage immediately following from the incident where Jesus' disciples were picking the ears of grain in the middle of a field on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees complained to Jesus that he is letting them break the Sabbath. And we looked at what all of that was about. Now, this passage is the very next thing that happens, okay? That was the end of chapter 2, and this is the end of chapter 3. Now, although they do follow on consecutively in the Bible, we don't really know whether it was like the very next thing that happened, that Jesus was in the synagogue. Mark says another time Jesus went into a synagogue, or into the synagogue. And I think there's a suggestion that this was just like another time. So not necessarily the next day, not necessarily the second day, later that day. But whatever the time gap there is between these two incidents, Mark puts them together because they actually go together, okay? They're two examples of Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath and how he moves from one level of teaching to another. So we need to think about the previous incident just for a few minutes. In the first incident, the sort of supposed infraction of the Sabbath is quite mild. The disciples are picking and eating like ears of wheat or something else, barley or something. And the Pharisees, they start whinging to Jesus about it. You're letting them break the Sabbath. And Jesus counters their complaint with this example of David, who, when he was on the run from Saul, he goes to the tabernacle and there's no bread, and there's only the bread that supports this kind of symbolic bread that's inside the tabernacle. And the priest gives it to David. And David's not supposed to eat it, but he eats it. And he gives it to his followers. And Jesus is saying that, some things are more important, okay? It's more important to give life. And he gives other examples. Matthew has a similar, Matthew gives the same story in a slightly different way. And in Matthew's version of it, Jesus says, look, the priests in the temple, they're working on the Sabbath, and yet they're innocent. And he also says, look, what you haven't understood is that through the prophet Hosea, God said, I desire mercy, not a sacrifice. And so the Pharisees and the religious teachers, they wouldn't really have liked Jesus telling them they didn't understand the Bible, because they were the people who, that was their whole persona and image. They were the people that understood the Bible better than everybody else. And that would have irritated them. But it possibly was just the beginning of the conflict with Jesus. And in the next bit that happens, the bit we just read in Mark chapter 3, we see Jesus sort of taking this conflict over the Sabbath to the next level, because he's not standing out in a cornfield out in the open. He's now going into the heart of their territory, which is into the synagogue, which was their domain. And this was the place where the religious leaders would not have wanted Jesus to make them look stupid, okay? Because this was their turf. So the text tells us that Jesus goes into a synagogue, and there was a man with a shriveled hand there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, and they were waiting to see if he would heal this man. And Jesus, not beating around the bush, he just goes straight ahead and heals the man. But first of all, he says to the man, stand up in front of everybody. And Jesus did this so that there would be absolutely no doubt about what was going to happen next. There was going to be no ambiguity. Everybody could see the man. Everybody could see the condition of his hand. Now, sometimes on Twitter, there's this thing I keep seeing on the internet from time to time. There's a guy in India who has raised his hand for 50 years. Have any of you seen that? There's a guy in India who has kept his right hand raised for 50 years. And it's completely withered. It's like a stick. And he's doing that as part of his religion. He's a Hindu. But I imagine, although that guy did that to himself, I thought of that when I thought of this guy. The man's hand was probably completely atrophied. It was a useless hand. Okay, this was going to be quite a miraculous miracle. So Jesus says, he gets the man to stand up, and he poses this question: which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And this is actually the question that we talked about last time. In other words, the question concerns the meaning of the Sabbath. What is it, and what is it for, and what does it mean, and who gets to say what it is for and what it means? In other words, where is the authority? Where is the authority? Where does that authority lie to say what the Sabbath is about? So Jesus asks this very simple and straightforward question, but it's also a very loaded and dangerous question. And the religious leaders, as usual, they sense the danger. And the rest of the people are oblivious, as usual, especially the disciples. They're probably oblivious. But the religious leaders, they sense the danger, and so they keep their mouths shut, which is what they always do when Jesus asks one of these questions. Probably the rest of the people are probably afraid of the religious leaders, afraid of being cast out of the synagogue, afraid of being ostracized. And so you can imagine like how electric the atmosphere was in the synagogue. You could imagine telling this story to your grandchildren in later years. I was there, and the atmosphere was electric, and we just, we didn't know what was going to happen next. So there's this terrible silence as Jesus asks this question. And Mark tells us that this grieves Jesus. He's deeply distressed, and he looks around in anger at their stubborn hearts. And then he says to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man's hand is completely healed and restored. And everybody would have seen it happen. Not only the miraculous transformation of the hand, but the process of it being healed in a few seconds. And the weird thing is that the immediate response of the religious leaders is to go out, and Mark tells us they go out and they decide, how can we kill Jesus? That's an interesting response to a miracle, isn't it? How can we kill the miracle worker? And there's this other detail that they go out and they plot with the Herodians to kill Jesus. So there are a couple of things here. First of all, I just want to draw attention to the stubbornness of the people, of the religious leaders. What does it mean here to be stubborn when you've seen a miracle or when you're about to see a miracle? In the previous story about the disciples in the grain field, Jesus had said that the Sabbath was made for man or for people, not the other way around. And he had given a solid example to back up his statement from the Old Testament. And he also mentioned this prophecy of Hosea, that God desires mercy and not a sacrifice. And yet, in spite of this clear teaching in the previous example, coming from someone that the crowds had already seen heal multitudes, because it says in the first chapter of Mark that Jesus already healed many, many people, multitudes of people. And so the people in this story, they've seen Jesus heal already. They know. This is why they were waiting for him to heal the man. There was no doubt about him being able to do it. They knew he could do it. The question was, would he do it on the Sabbath? And yet the people hearing Jesus in this incident, they're still on the fence as to their allegiance to Jesus. And when you sit on the fence, really what you're doing is, with regard to Jesus, is that you're actually rejecting Jesus. There had been masses of evidence that Jesus was sent by God, and he was healing in a power and teaching with a wisdom that nobody had ever heard or seen before. And yet they still, in spite of that, in spite of the crystal clear evidence that Jesus was sent from God, they still refuse to answer the question that Jesus poses them. Is it lawful and right to heal on the Sabbath, to do good, or to do evil and to kill? And this put me in mind of some of the popular debate online with some of the new atheists. Although I hear that the new atheist movement is fading a little bit in these days. But in spite of what the modern atheists say, faith is not driven by evidence. So the religious leaders in this story, they had all the evidence they needed to conclude that Jesus was from God, and yet they didn't believe in him. So what was going on? Well, they had a deeper and prior commitment to something else that amounted in the end to their own religion, and we might see a little bit about what that was about in a minute. And also there's the statement by Mark that their response is to want to kill him. So the thing to note is that the Pharisees joined forces with the Herodians, and these, you can't imagine two groups that would have been more opposed at the time. The Pharisees in particular would have hated the Herodians. The Herodians were not religious. The Pharisees were ultra-religious. The Herodians were allied with Rome and the Roman agenda of oppression, and the Pharisees were all about the purity of religion and the purity of Israel and trying to get back to a state under God. Herod himself was considered by many not even to be Jewish himself. He was an adulterous and immoral man. And so there was absolutely no normal common cause between the Herodians and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees would have seen the Herodians as complete pagans. So the reason they joined forces, I think, is because both groups sensed a threat to their power. And so the Pharisees, in spite of all their posturing and their dressing up and their sort of religious facade that they were presenting, when it came down to it for them, the thing that mattered was their power and status. They sort of presented themselves as people that cared about the truth. But we have to bear in mind what Jesus said about the truth in John chapter 14. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So the Pharisees cared about truth, but when the person of the truth was in front of them, then they rejected him. And actually, Jesus came along and he presented a straight message of truth. Jesus was saying, this is what the Bible teaches, this is what the Bible teaches about me, and this is what it means. And it wasn't difficult or obscure. And the Pharisees, in a way, they should have been able to deliver a simple message of truth, but for them, it threatened their sort of job security, if you like. If they had preached a simple, understandable message for people to believe and apply, it would have been to empower the ordinary people of the time. But they preferred to retain their status as the people that were the ones with the religious secrets and the religious teaching. So you've heard that expression that knowledge is power. The Pharisees believed that knowledge is power, and they liked being the ones with the knowledge, and they didn't like giving their power away. And so they made common cause with probably the people they hated the most to get rid of Jesus. And so what we have here is basically a sort of irrational hatred of Jesus, because Jesus presented an existential threat to them. And this, sorry, I jumped over a little bit, but this is what I was trying to say a minute ago about the question of evidence and faith being based on evidence. All of us, in a way, we have a starting point. We have a commitment. And the Pharisees saw things in terms of their prior commitment, which was that they wanted to be the ones in charge. And so an atheist will often say in debate, and I've heard this many times, show me God and I'll believe, or show me a miracle and I'll believe. But what usually happens when something miraculous happens is an atheist will say, well, yeah, that was pretty far out, but I think the reason we can't explain it is that we don't have enough information. And so I think what will happen is in future there might be some new evidence that comes up to explain what happened. And so I'm going to just suspend my judgment for the moment. And so what happens is, because they have a pre-commitment to exclude anything supernatural, when something supernatural happens, they've already decided that it can't be admitted as evidence. And so in a sense, this is the position that the Pharisees were in. Jesus was there in front of them. He was performing these miracles. He was doing everything possible to demonstrate and to prove who he was. And yet they were quibbling, and they were nitpicking, and they were saying things like, if this was the Son of God, then why would he heal on the Sabbath? And so they began to expose themselves, began to expose what it was that they really believed. Interestingly, that they often were asking Jesus for a sign. And there are quite a few instances in the Gospels where the Pharisees and even Herod himself, both groups, asked Jesus for a sign. What sign are you going to do to tell us that you have the authority to do this? Herod was wanting Jesus to do a sign when Jesus was presented before him when he was arrested. And Jesus actually said that the asking for a sign is a sign of unbelief. When you go to a religious teacher and you say, show me a sign, it is usually just an excuse not to believe. And so Jesus said in Matthew 12, he said, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So all this is, I'm trying to say that the Herodians and the Pharisees, their most important commitment was to maintaining their positions, maintaining their power. Jesus came and he didn't go after them directly. It's not that he attacked their power directly, but he did attack their power indirectly. They knew what was going on. And so that is why they responded with this irrational hatred. I'd like to say a few words about the relationship of the Sabbath. Okay, this took place on the Sabbath, to the way we understand power and the use of power. One thing we talked about previously is the worldview of the ancient world. In the ancient world, the world that Israel came out of, if you like, the world of ancient Egypt, the world of ancient Babylon, the world that completely surrounded God's people 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. There was a common kind of thread in the way people viewed reality. And people saw that everything in life was interconnected. So gods, people, animals, forces of nature, things you couldn't see like spirits, all of these things were part of a great one, a great big holistic whole that was all connected. And this whole was a process within which certain things were becoming divine, and there were higher and lower beings in this reality. Some were more evolved than others. And so some people had more divinity or spirituality than other people or other creatures. And some people were becoming gods. And some people were already halfway there to be gods. And so in ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh was seen as a man, a God-man. He was seen as a being that stood between heaven and earth, if you like. And we know that the later Roman Empire, before the time of Jesus, the Roman emperors began to say that they were gods, and it's on their coins. And we can see it from archaeological evidence that they claimed to be gods. And so in this whole mentality and worldview, there's a hierarchy, right? Because some people are simply better than other people. And when you have an outlook like that, all kinds of abuses of power are possible. So you can have a caste system where some people inherently have less value than other people, or are even unclean in some way. And the only way out of that is by an endless cycle of reincarnation. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for your next reincarnation, you just have to put up with it. You have to make do with the status you've got. Or this can be a justification for slavery. Or we can have a society where men are held to be inherently more valuable than women or children. And like once we got talking about this, we could actually, I'm sure we could think of lots of other examples from history. And so while all of life is interconnected and there's this hierarchy, the forces that govern it are inflexible. So for example, to escape from karma, you have to do better in life. You have to try harder. You have to do more good deeds. You have to do more religious rituals. And then when you die, you might climb up a little bit further up the ladder towards divinity. You might practice rituals or practice self-denial, endless fasting, that kind of thing. But in the present reality, the hierarchy can't be challenged, okay? It's fixed. And so this is great for those with power, and it's not so great for those without power and status. So that's my potted version of the ancient worldview, okay, into which God first chose a people and decided to separate them out of it. And the Bible gives us a completely different view of reality. So in the Bible's view, God is completely separate from the things that God has made. And there are laws that govern creation, but God isn't subject to those laws because he made those laws. And the other thing to mention is that because God is separate from the things he's made, there's no way within creation, there's no way to connect with God. You can't connect with God. There's nothing you can do as a creature to sort of climb up and connect with God. You can't make the connection because there's an uncrossable gulf between God and the things he has made. There's nothing we can do, okay? Which in a way is bad news, okay? That's bad news. We can't have a relationship with God. End of story. But the good news is Jesus is incarnated as a man and he comes into the world. So the movement in the true reality, not the pagan ancient worldview, but the true reality is that although we are separated from God, God comes to us. Okay? And more than that, God draws us to Jesus. Jesus said in John's Gospel that nobody can come to me unless the Father first draws him to me or her to me. So when we come to God, when we have a relationship with God, even when we are a non-believer and we start praying, Lord, are you there? God, are you there? Please show me. This is often how many of us became Christians, whenever it was. We start to think maybe there is a God, and maybe we might pray a prayer. Lord, if you're there, please show me. A very simple prayer. In what I'm explaining, you can't pray that prayer unless God enables you to pray that prayer. God is the one who takes the initiative, and that's because he loves to do it that way. That's God's grace. He comes to us because we're helpless. And so what holds the whole universe together is not the set of rules of karma or inflexible rules. what holds the whole universe together is God's creative power and his loving care for the things he's made. And so what that means is that the universe is personal. There isn't a kind of automatic cause and effect that's working in reality. Instead, grace is operating. And we need to think about this. Sometimes there are bad people in the world who do bad things. Famous people in history. And sometimes it seems that they go on for quite a while before it comes to an end. And so that's an example of God's patience. God is patient with good people and bad people. He gives bad people lots of time, often, to repent. Sometimes they need to just mature in the bad things they're doing. But on the other side of that, God gives us plenty of time because none of us are perfect. All of us as Christians, we all stumble and we all fall into sin. And everything we try to do for God is usually tainted in some way, with some imperfection or some failure or some bad motive or something. And yet God takes all of that and he accepts it. And he gives us grace and he gives us more time. Now, I'm speaking in a general way. Obviously, there are many people who die young and there are many people who die suddenly. And so I'm speaking in the most general terms about what the Bible tells us, that God is loving and generous and patient with us. Now, what has any of this got to do with the Sabbath? I hear you thinking. Think about the Sabbath. It's a break with the normal routine of life, okay? It removes us, when we rest one day out of 7, it removes us from the activity. It removes us from the activity of all the things we do that we do to sort of make things happen for us. And so when we rest one day out of 7, what this is actually, it's the same, I hope this works, but it's sort of like a break in the same way that God is separate from his creation. It's a separation between us and our control of our lives. So when we enjoy a day off, a Sabbath's rest, what we're doing is we're resting in the knowledge that God is in control. And actually, I'm not in control of everything I do. So, as an example, think about people we might know in our lives who are workaholics. Workaholics in a bad way, okay? The people who absolutely cannot stop working because they feel that if they stop working, then they will lose control over what's happening. And in their mentality, everything that happens is down to them. So that if they let go for a moment, then they're going to lose control over it. And I think we live in an age, although we personally might not behave like that, I think we live in a kind of hyperactive age, which is a little bit like this, where nothing stops, where work never ends, where consumerism never ends, the shops never close. I mean, we're online 24/7, and I think the mental health repercussions of that, I think we're all aware, that we live in the midst of a mental health crisis and also a physical health crisis. And I think it's to do with this sense of everything I do is down to me to make happen. But when we rest one day in 7, what we do is we say, I might work 6 days or 5 days of the week. I might do what I need to do to pay the mortgage and to raise my family and to help others and to have a holiday occasionally. But in the end, all of those blessings and good things that I enjoy, they come from God. So keeping the Sabbath is a way of acknowledging that God is in control for us. And actually, this feeds into our understanding of our own salvation as Christians. So, as I said, if God is separate from his creation, then there's nothing that we can do to bridge that divide. Okay? We can't save ourselves by doing good, by helping others, by giving money away, by going to church or any of those things. Salvation comes to us from God by his grace. And this is no surprise that the first Passover actually took place on a Sabbath. So they ate the Passover meal on a Sabbath. And the Sabbath signifies the deliverance of the people from slavery and sin and bondage in Egypt. And this is also the same reason why the New Testament talks about Jesus himself being our Sabbath. So because Jesus has finished, he's done his work of salvation for us. He's done everything he needs to do to save us is done. He died on a cross. He rose from the dead. He ascended to the Father's side in heaven. There's absolutely nothing that we can do to be saved except accept that fact of what Jesus has done for us. It's a free gift. Our job is not to strive to attain it. We've been given it. Our job is to believe and then to live in terms of it. And the Pharisees should have known this about the Sabbath because actually it was all prefigured in Genesis. Adam, if you remember the story about creation, God created the world in 6 days and on the seventh day he rested. Adam was the very last thing that God made towards the evening of the sixth day. And then the Bible says God looked at everything he'd made and he said it was very good and he rested on the seventh day. But actually that's from God's point of view. But I have to think about it from Adam's point of view. Adam gets created on, let's say, Friday afternoon, and Jewish day of rest is Saturday. So Adam gets created on Friday afternoon, and God tells him what he's going to do with his life. God gives him a task to do. I want you to fill the earth and to rule over everything I've made. And so Adam gets made, and he gets a job on Friday afternoon. But then, what is the very first thing that Adam does? Has a day off. Adam's first full day of life was the Sabbath. So we need to think about that. That detail is there for a reason. As Christians, we face the world from a position of rest. Actually, because we believe in Jesus. Jesus has given us rest from our striving to please God. He's done that for us. He gives that to us. And so we have a position of rest and authority in him. And so our lives, therefore, are not to be a constant striving to be accepted by God. We're not to be constantly living under a cloud of guilt or a sense that we haven't done enough to be successful or have never done enough to help others, or whatever it is we think we need to do what we want to achieve or to be. On the contrary, our attitude should be we just do the best we can and we trust God with the rest. Okay, because the foundation of our lives is that Jesus has done the most important thing for us. And so we operate in terms of that, in terms of what he's done. Now, last time, we looked at the two different readings in the law. So there were two readings of the law in the first part of the Bible. There's one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. And 40 years separated the two readings of the law. And when it comes to the fourth commandment, the Sabbath, the law is given slightly different about the Sabbath in both occasions. In the first time, God says, just as God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, so you should rest on the seventh. To remember that God made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. But then, when the law is read again the second time in Deuteronomy, a completely different reason is given. Moses says, you're to rest 1 day out of 7 because you were slaves in Egypt, and you're to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And the interesting thing is, like we talked about last time, is that nobody hearing that second reading of the law had been a slave in Egypt. They had either been not yet born or else they were too little at the time of the Exodus. It was a completely separate generation, and yet God says to them, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. therefore keep the Sabbath. And so what we're to understand from these two readings of the law, if you like, about resting, is that the first reading in Exodus, it gives us the pattern of how we're to rest. So we're to rest one day in 7 if we can. And remember what I said last time. This isn't a strict law that if we fail to do it, we've sinned against God. This is a recipe for health and wholeness. This is what we should do if we can do it. Rest one day out of 7 if you can. But the second reading of the law gives us the goal of our rest, which is liberation for those that are oppressed. And this is why, like last time we talked about, the Israelites were to create a society in which nobody was oppressed, because they had been oppressed and they knew what it was like to be slaves. And so there was not to be a hint of oppression in the society that they would build. So the goal of the Sabbath is liberation for those that are oppressed. And I think this is the reason why Jesus was so grieved in this instance in the synagogue. You know, the Pharisees, they wanted to deny this man his healing on the Sabbath. His healing represented the redemption of his life. Think about what it meant for that guy to have his hand back. He could be productive again. He could be beautiful again as a human being. For those who witnessed that healing, what Jesus did represented the restoration of all things. Jesus went about healing everybody, and he healed those people because they were sick and they needed to be healed because he loved them. But in another level, for those that weren't sick and didn't need to be healed, for those who saw those miracles taking place, the miracles were a sign that God's kingdom was coming, that a new order of things was happening, that the curse of sin and death was being rolled back with the coming of the person of Jesus. And so that's what was happening in the synagogue just there. Jesus' signs and his miracles are signs of his kingdom breaking into the world. However, the Pharisees were more interested in the power and status that they derived from controlling the Sabbath, gave them. They made it about them, okay? They made it about their status and power. But in focusing on the minutiae of the rules of the Sabbath, inadvertently, I think the Pharisees had begun to adopt that pagan worldview we just talked about. In other words, it reduces everything to impersonal forces. And that is why they were so careful to observe every tiny little rule, and even rules that they made up to add on to the existing rules. Because they sort of believed that in this strict theory, if you like, of cause and effect. And they missed the point that the kingdom of God and the universe are personal, and that we serve a loving God who has come into our midst to heal broken and hurting people. The Pharisees came face to face with the person of that, with the person of the loving and personal God. And they found that their response was that they wanted to kill him.